Okay, so Chodesh Tov, happy Tammuz of all the months. Say happy Tammuz. Right, so seeing this Tammuz, we have the 3 weeks approaching us, the time between the breaching of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. And I want to talk a little bit about what it means to talk about Judaism and Torah and faith and stuff in a time marked by the destruction of the temple and more generally. There's a bunch of sources. We're potentially just going to look at the first one. The first one is possibly my favorite Gemara. It's incredible. I'm a huge fan of this Gemara. This Gemara Yoma. And it is, I think it's just fundamental for understanding like how Chazal are grappling with the destruction and what Judaism means after the destruction. We're gonna talk about that. Like, what does it mean to keep going with Judaism? If Judaism was one thing it was in many ways very much centered around the Beit HaMikdash, and then it keeps going afterwards. And how does our relationship with God change? Does it change? What about Torah? If we have time after that, we might look at some sources from Rav Shigar and Rav Fruman, which is what we do in all these years, people who've come to them before. That's what I do. And just to give you a taste ahead of time, the main sort of two ideas that I want to talk about with this Gemara are the way our relationship with God should center on when things change in our sort of lived experience. The first step, the most important step, is not to lie about God. That our relationship with God should not require us to say something we think is false, or we experience as false. And then the second step is that the part of the significance of not saying things that are falsify our experience is the idea for being open to new things and new ideas. And those really come out in the Rav Shigar and Rav Fruman pieces, but they come through very clearly as well in this Gemara. So I want to read from the English. We'll read it through once and then just go through it a little more in depth, one layer after another. And this is the translation from Sefaria, which is from Koren. It includes a lot of stuff that's not in the text itself. So just to read through the whole thing is just the clearest translation available. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, "Why are the sages of those generations called the members of the Great Assembly, Anshe Knesset HaGedolah? It's because they returned the crown of the Holy One, blessed be He, to its former glory. How so? Moses came and said in his prayer, 'The great, the mighty, and the awesome God.' Jeremiah the prophet came and said, 'Gentiles,' meaning the minions of Nebuchadnezzar, 'are carousing in his sanctuary. Where is his awesomeness?' Therefore he did not say awesome in his prayer. 'The great God, the mighty Lord of hosts is his name.'" It's a quote from Yirmiyahu. He says great and mighty, he does not say awesome. Then Daniel came and said, "Gentiles are enslaving his children. Where is his might?" Therefore he did not say mighty in his prayer. The pasuk says, "The great and awesome God." The members of the great assembly came and said, "On the contrary, this is the might of his might. This is the fullest expression of it, that he conquers his inclination, and that he exercises patience toward the wicked. And these acts are also expressed as awesomeness. Were it not for the awesomeness of the Holy One, blessed be He, how could one people, I mean the Jewish people who are alone and hated by the Gentile nations, survive among the nations?" Gemara asks, "And the rabbis," meaning in this case Yirmiyahu and Daniel, "how could they do this and uproot an ordinance instituted by Moshe, the greatest teacher, who instituted the mention of these attributes in prayer?" Rabbi Elazar said, "They did so because they knew of the Holy One, blessed be He, that He is truthful. Therefore, consequently, they did not speak falsely about Him." So, there's 3 stages to the Gemara here. After the first opening question, the frames this Gemara as a question of how did Anshe Knesset HaGedolah get their name? What made them this specific, special group of people? It starts a historical narrative. It goes from Moshe to Daniel and Yirmiyahu to Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. The first, is Moshe created this prayer. And there's a general rule. When we're making brachot and feel we try not to stray from the format Chazal used. And the same sort of instinct here. We want to keep praying the same way Moshe prayed. And the language at the end is this is a takana of Moshe in some sense, that he established that this is how we daven. And then Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel, each in slightly different ways, refuse to daven the way Moshe davened. They say, I can't say God is Norah. He's almost fearfully awesome because there are non-Jews dancing in the Beit HaMikdash. What's so fearful and awesome about that? And Daniel is the one of the prophets who's around not just before Galut, like Yirmiyahu is, and seeing Galut sort of start and prophesying about it, but during a time of Galut. And it says, we subsist among the nations. We, exist as a ghost of our former selves. How is that? Where is the might of that? And then Anshe Knesset will come, and this is the next stage. They actually share the same historical experiences as Daniel, right? They come after destruction. They come in time of Galut. But instead of saying, well, sort of empirically, God is not mighty, they say, no, we actually have a different model for what mighty means. Right? This is a quote from Pirkei Avot, Ezehu Gibor HaKaveh Shet Yitzro. Part of the problem with bringing the English is you missed that, but that's what they essentially reference here. Someone who is Gibor is someone who's Koveh Shet Yitzro, which in this case, they say, means God. God is conquering his inclination, which would be his inclination to, punish the wicked who are dancing in his temple and to save the Jews from Galut. That God's might is almost paradoxically expressed through not being mighty. And that's an idea in Gvura that's going to go from this sort of mission in Pirkei Avot forward throughout the Jewish tradition, that might on some level means restraint. The ability to hold yourself back is its own form of might, if not the form of might. But here that's manifest in God not doing things we might otherwise consider mighty and heroic. And the final stage of this Gemara is the Gemara is going to reflect back on the historical narrative it's just told. And it says, how did the prophets do this? Who said they could not say things Moshe said? And if we try, generally speaking, to pray as we've always prayed, to follow the prayers set down by our forebears, and Moshe above all, how did they just be like, nah, I'm going to leave that out. That seems wrong. And Rabbi Elazar answers, they did so because they knew about the Holy One, blessed He, that He is truthful. Consequently, they did not speak falsely about Him. In the Hebrew there, I like, lefikach lo kizvubo. Kizvu can have connotations like literally don't speak falsely about Him, not make Him false, not betray Him. It's a very powerful language. There's almost a betrayal of God in speaking falsely about God. Any questions so far? So the first thing I want to start off by noting is the contrast with...
So the man the great assembly was saying the greatest thing about God is He filled with strength, and he didn't annihilate all of our enemies. You're saying the great assembly said, yeah?
Right. They're saying, Daniel said, I can't, say that God is mighty when the Jewish people are in foreign lands ruled by foreign nations. And they're saying, no, that's exactly what makes Him mighty, is that God has not... destroyed the non-Jews, and He's in fact enabled the Jews to survive in that form, when it's not necessarily intuitive that people would survive.
What exactly do they mean by speak falsely about?
So, in this context, it means that, because the question is, how did Yirmiyahu and Daniel do this, and upwrote an ordinance instituted by Moshe, meaning not use all three attributes that Moshe used. All right, Moshe.
Attributes meaning names, or
No. So Moshe describes God as El Gadol Gibor v'Hanorah, great, mighty, awesome. Those are the three attributes under discussion here, and they choose not to use all three of them.
so falsely meaning just like different, not.
Well, they didn't describe God in a way that they perceived as false. Meaning, because they felt that to call God awesome, in Yirmiyahu's case, to call God mighty for Daniel, that would have been lying.
From their perspective.
As far as they're concerned. And that's significant, because what's going to happen, essentially, is we have three slightly different perspectives here. We have Moshe, Yirmiyahu and Daniel, and then Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. And those three perspectives fit into two different historical time periods. The Moshe, who comes far before the Churban, and then Yirmiyahu and Daniel, who are at and after the Churban, and the Anshe Knesset Gedolah as well, after the Churban. And so one thing I think is worth doing is contrasting this with sort of the model of the Torah for what it means to have God be present, which is just, I come up all over the place. I brought, not on your sheet, but I grabbed this for myself, some psukim from Devarim Perek Chet, 8th chapter. It says, "For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, with a land with streams and springs and fountains issuing from plain and hill. A land of wheat and barley, of vine, figs, and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land where you may eat food without stint, where you will lack nothing, a land whose rocks are iron, and from whose hills you can mine copper. When you've eaten your fill, you give thanks to the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you."
So where were you reading from?
That's not on your page. That's just a model for what the Torah really sort of talks about when they talk about God, being present in the life of the nation. And that is followed by psukim about make sure you keep the Torah and don't forget God, because it's always kept in line with keeping the Torah. But I think it's important to note that the Torah has a very strong sense of God is the person who takes care of you in a very obvious way. There's a really good book that came out last year, 2 years ago, from Koren on Haggai, Malachi, and Zechariah by Rabbi Chaim Angel. He talks a lot about how those prophets are people who make the similar switch Anshe Knesset Hagedolah make. God's presence doesn't necessarily mean that everything is going well for the Jews in the biggest sense of it. That in the time of the second Beit HaMikdash and after the Galut, the Jews come back to Israel, but they're not sovereign. They're still underneath the control of Babel in Persia. And that can still be seen as a time of God's presence. God can be present without having to just give you everything all the time. In the sense of, bounty and plenty, which in the verses I just read are equivalent to God's presence, to God being there for the people. You can have God being there for you without it looking like that. And so that is, I think, the shift that's happening in this, the sort of three perspectives in this Gemara. As we go from that, and that's what Moshe describes. Very specifically, I took that from Devarim, much of which is Moshe's sort of last speeches. And then the rest of the figures in that Gemara don't see that anymore. What do we do in a time when we don't have plenty and bounty? We don't have the land. And we don't have control of the land. And Daniel and Yirmiyahu say, well, we can't describe God the same way we did before. Before, we described God in a way that reflected our experience of God. Right? Mighty and awesome describes a God who takes care of his people in the land. A God who has, the Beit HaMikdash that is sanctified and protected, and a place where you go to experience God's glory, not a place for non-Jews to dance, people who invaded. And so Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel, we can't use the same language because the language no longer accurately reflects our experience. And then the last perspective.
Is it in the Tanakh that Jeremiah said what he said about that he's only going to say great God, he's not going to say awesome, and Daniel also is not going to say mighty? Where did it take it from, sorry?
The Gemara quotes psukim. They're recontextualizing the psukim a little bit because the Gemara and the psukim, they're in here in the Gemara. Yirmiyahu said, "The great God, the mighty Lord of hosts, is his name."
And the Gemara is saying the reason why he thinks Jeremiah says it is because...
Well, the Gemara is pointing out that when he said that, he only used two of the three attributes that Moshe used. And the Gemara is going to explain why did he only use those two.
It might have been a coincidence.
But the Gemara doesn't think it's a coincidence. That's one way of reading it. You could say, I read the text, it doesn't say anything about, God's presence and justice and all those things, but that's how the Gemara reads it. The same thing for Daniel. And that third perspective of Anshe Knesset Hagedolah is that the in a sense, the language is more fluid than that. We can still describe God. In fact, we should describe God using the same language we described before. There's the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, when he said, Heziro HaTorah Liyoshna, they returned God's crown to his former glory by continuing to use the same language about God, but with a different meaning. Any questions so far? Yes.
Sorry, I noticed a little bit of a pun, which is that they're the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, and Gadol is the one name that's never taken away. Is there anything to that?
I haven't found anything. I've noticed that as well when I was preparing for this year, and I feel like there must be something, but I haven't found it. Anything else? Great. So
all this number one is the Babylon Talmud interpretation of why Jeremiah and Daniel missed out certain things, and why the Great when did the Great Assembly come out and then talk about them? Do we talk about God like that? Was this taken from when it mentioned about the Great Assembly?
You're saying where did they get that this is what the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah did?
Yes.
It doesn't say where they got it.
Okay.
The information about the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah all comes from texts like the Mishnah and Gemara and stuff. So it's essentially an internal tradition because it's roughly the same historical tradition of figures. When the Gemara and Mishnah talk about Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, they're saying those people we came from. So they don't need to cite external text for it. So the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, part of the question of this text is why are they doing what they do, right? I mean, even if they think, no, this is like a good thing, our experience now is in fact a form of experiencing God's presence, why are they trying to go back to Moshe's language? Like, what is the significance of Moshe prayed this way, we should pray this way? Tradition. It worked. Right, so one of those is just part of who we are, is that, we come from Moshe. There's that effectivity, that somehow the words do something.
Yeah, I think there's a certain statement being made when you decide we can't say this anymore. This categorically does not apply to God. Meaning, anachnu ke basar vadam. It's a little bit. I want to say like hubristic, but at the same time, like God is kind of this all-encompassing, beyond nature kind of entity, and all of a sudden to come and say, even though we're not experiencing God according to this definition of this particular word, it's not necessarily acceptable for us to now come and say, no, this word no longer applies to God. I mean, no, okay, it just applies to God in a different way. Meaning, it's kind of it would be kind of a big deal for us for like Anshe Knesset Hagdolah to come and say the way that Moshe experienced God is so far removed from our experience that we can't even use the same language. Meaning, it's a certain statement of like spiritual continuity of we're all experiencing the same God, and we can even say the same things about. We can even use the same words, but we can also mean different things, and it's not necessarily so we're not breaking completely from the experience of Nevi'ah Nevi'im. It's just we're being honest about the fact that we can't necessarily understand the words that he used in the same way that he used them. It's kind of like you don't want to absolutely categorically deny that certain words don't apply to God.
Right, I think there's an element of humility involved in saying that my experience of God and language is not the ultimate one. I think it's notable that Chazal aren't saying, Yirmiyahu and Daniel tried to change the way Jews pray, so much as they changed the way they themselves prayed. That they couldn't daven using those words, but they never said, we should, obliterate those words from the Torah or anything like that. And I think that would be an important nuance in terms of how you try to, do anything else with this Gemara. But I think part of it is the aspect of tradition you mentioned, as well as the way you're talking about language as almost like a theological resource. That this, in a sense, is like everything Chazal are doing after the destruction of the temple and the transition from the land to galut, and transition from a religion that's in many ways shaped around one, the avodah and the Beit Hamikdash, the korbanot, everything that happens there, and then outside of that, in like social laws and civil laws and things like that, that religion changes in very many ways when they transition into galut. I think one of my favorite Gemaras about it is a Gemara in Brachot about, from the day that the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, God has no space in this world, but Dal Alamot of Halacha.
The second one, the first one.
So
Also the second one didn't have the same significance as the first one.
Significance is a good question. The second one didn't have the same miracles, the same sense of presence, but it's not at all clear it didn't have the same significance.
Yeah, I suppose what you just said.
Part of what I think is incredible
when
about
when the second temple was built, some of them were crying because it wasn't the same as the first temple.
And yet simultaneously, some of the it's a line from Ezra. The people who could remember the first temple were crying, and the people who didn't were yelling in excitement, and the voices would blend together. Yes.
So this is a bit off topic,
Mhm.
since you already mentioned brachot. Is it correct to say that Moshe and Daniel are many times brought as examples of prayer? Because from what I remember in brachot, there's this whole list where they go through different people. I want to say there's Hannah, and then David, and then Moshe, and then Daniel. And I'm wondering if we have different people mentioned there as well, and I feel like the reasoning is from one we learn the way to approach God, and one we learn the words, and from Daniela specifically, remember that it's how you pray, meaning physically, what you're supposed to do, and I don't know, it just threw me back to that, and I was wondering what the connection between them.
It's very interesting. I don't know. I think also the people who we see, davening in Tanakh are the people who are going to become models for how we daven afterwards. Interesting, sort of similar parallel is the people we see mourning in Tanakh become models for how we mourn afterwards, which can often be unintuitive. So Yechezkel actually becomes a model for some mourning practices. It's good. It'd be an interesting research project to go through the whole Gemara and see how did Moshe pray in the Gemara, as it were, and how did Daniel pray, and Chana is a set of forceful davening almost. But you have to write a book on that.
There also are a few people there, and here it seems that they're a little concerned about the fact that people have drifted off from what Moshe did.
Right. So I think the Gemara here is sort of reflecting on moments in historical prayer that it's aware of, right? Because we have Moshe, Daniel, Moshe, Yirmiyahu, and Daniel, and they all look similar, but with significant differences. And they're trying to say, why are those significant differences happening? It's because of the different historical experiences that Moshe lived sort of at a time. Well, they don't as clearly say Moshe said it this way because of what was happening to him. But it's very clear that Daniel and Yirmiyahu change what they say from what Moshe said because of what they experienced.
So it's not just a matter of prayer, it's a matter of the experience
right.
behind it.
So it's a question of the matter of the relationship between prayer and experience. That the language you use in prayer, they're saying you shouldn't lie with. And it's a bit of a different topic, but that comes up even today in questions of do we say a prayer for rebuilding Jerusalem, or do we mention the ruins of Jerusalem, and in our davening when there's no ruins, and I'm not a halachist, that's beyond me. But it's a discussion people have. But what I want to talk about is the shift from the Judaism of the Beit HaMikdash and the land of Israel to Judaism of Galut, and then even Beit Sheni, where we have a Beit HaMikdash, but it's different, and what does that mean? And even after that, that part of what Chazal are trying to do is to keep having sort of the same Judaism with the same Jewish words and the same Torah in a totally different environment, which leads to all kinds of interesting discussions about what mitzvot apply in the land of Israel and outside the land of Israel, and all of a sudden outside the land of Israel means more than a couple small groups of people who live outside the land. It means most of the Jewish people, and the weight of those two categories has shifted. And the sense of like continuity between who we are in Galut and who we are in the land of Israel is very much about our ability to hold on to the words that were used before, whether in the like sense of the physical words that compose the Torah, and then to like continue to return to the Torah, or the sense of the like theological ideas conveyed in those words, that our ability to go back to the words we've used before and apply them to our lives and our new lived experience is sort of a critical element in our continuity more generally, and specifically in the idea of Torah Shebaal Peh. The idea that Torah Shebaal Peh involves a significant interpretive tradition. It's rules for and ways we have in the past interpreted the Torah, is because we're trying to keep the Torah relevant to every single moment, even when those moments are radically different from the ones that came before them. And this is a little unrelated, but it has to do with one of my favorite quotes. There's a 20th century German Jewish philosopher named Franz Rosenzweig, who wrote this ridiculous book of philosophy called The Star of Redemption. It's just impossible to read. But someone had asked him, is it a Jewish book? Is it not a Jewish book? What makes it a Jewish book? And he wrote an essay called The New Thinking, where he's talking about it, and he says that what makes it Jewish is the Jewish words. This is, to be sure, a Jewish book, not one that deals with Jewish things, for then the books of the Protestant Old Testament scholar would be Jewish books, because Christians also write books about Tanakh, but rather one for which, when to say what it has to say, especially the new thing it has to say, the old Jewish words come. And to some level, what makes something Jewish is the fact that it's being said in Jewish words. I think I'd go beyond that. I've had discussions with people, how do you define the term Torah, right? What makes something Torah beyond the very narrow definition of the 5 books of Moshe? And one critical element of any way anyone tries to define Torah has to be that it keeps using words Jews have used for Torah in the past. That the Torah of each generation is deeply rooted in and in dialogue with, and in a sense speaks with, the words of Torah of the past.
I think either Larry or Cardozo said something similar when they were talking about tefillah, that the reason that we have to continue to use the same nusach for all these generations that are constantly put in from Tehillim and from the Nevi'im and all these places is to continue going back and drawing back to that, like, the original source of these words of power, to be basing ourselves based on, like, that original context.
Right, absolutely. And I think part of that also connects to what you were saying, Larry, about sort of the we're not going to cancel out any of that sort of theological well of language and the ways we have for talking about God, that there's a lot of really sort of powerful resources there. And one thing I want to note is that the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, when they reinterpret the meaning of the word Gibor, they don't do that out of nowhere, right? They themselves have gone back to a traditional understanding of the word Gibor. Ezehu Gibor HaKovesh et Yitzro is not an idea that like originates in this Gemara. That there's a sense that they looked back to the tradition, not just because they wanted to save that word, because they had a strong sense of of how much there is in the tradition. The tradition includes both understanding God as mighty because of all the things God gives us and does for us, and also God as mighty because He simply allows us to survive even if we're not, in charge. That the tradition includes many more possibilities, even in a given word, than we're often used to thinking about. And a really sort of critical element in living the tradition in a changing world is being aware of how rich the tradition is. I want to continue talking a little bit about why Anshe Knesset Gedolah are doing what they're doing. I want to make reference to a different Gemara. It's also an important one. It's, I think, a little more famous than this one. It's called Tanur Shel Achnai. Tanur Shel Achnai is a story about an argument about whether or not a certain oven is impure. But the critical element is not that. It's how the debate is resolved. It comes down to a debate between all of the Beit Midrash on one side and Rabbi Eliezer on the other side. And Eliezer has answers to every question, and they still don't accept it when he says. So he starts doing miracles, and a river flows backwards, and a tree gets up and walks, and the walls of the Beit Midrash begin to cave in. All in order to prove that he's right, until eventually a voice rings out from heaven, a heavenly voice, and says he's right. And Rabbi Yeshua stands to the other side of the room and says, Lo b'shamayim, the Torah is not in heaven. And the Torah already said, to follow the majority. So we're the majority. It doesn't matter if on whatever mystical level, you're right, that the world agrees with you and God agrees with you. It doesn't matter. What matters is that God gave us a Torah. The Torah says the majority is right. That's how it works.
It's a bit contradictory there if heavenly voice speaks says woman, because if heavenly voice is a form of prophecy.
So that, I think, is the radical core of that Gemara, is that the ultimate enemy of the Torah is prophecy. You cannot have the Torah as the continuing law of the people, as the thing that we live with and that guides us, if you have new prophecy all the time. That's why when there are prophets who, for some reason, do something that's against the Torah, they say we have to do a korban outside the Beit HaMikdash or something, it's always a hora'at sha'ah. It's a temporary initiative, something that can only be done now for this moment and not afterwards, because the only thing that is a law for now and the future to be carried out in every situation is the Torah. And that if you have prophecy, it can always just upset the Torah. It can disrupt the life of the nation, which is a nation dedicated to the Torah. Because prophecy, a continuing prophecy, means that suddenly the Torah could change radically, right? The Torah could just go away.
This isn't at some point not to have any prophets anymore. That's what it seems like.
In order to, the Chazal say that the sages are, preferable to prophets, and one way of understanding that is simply because they're able to do the same thing, to show us the divine wisdom and will in any new situation by reference to old texts. That while it's a different story, you do find prophets quoting other prophets, but the essential thing that is prophecy is the new voice of God appearing in a situation. Right? God is going to say something new. It might be the same thing he said before. The people always need to hear that they're doing the wrong thing and have to do tshuva. But there's a new voice going to happen, and you don't know what that's going to do. That could just, say throw everything out the window. I'm not a New Testament scholar, but certainly the way the Jewish tradition has understood, Jesus and Paul is very often that's what they were doing. They're coming and saying God's will has changed. We're throwing out the Torah.
Yeah, but there's no proof, right? There's no proof, right, that they're a prophet.
Right. So that's a different question. Meaning, if you read Yirmiyahu, nobody thinks Yirmiyahu is a real prophet. They have other prophets who disagree with Yirmiyahu and they fight and stuff. Nobody has proof at the time.
Yeah, I was going to say that's probably why the idea of false prophets is such a problem. Because if they can change words of the Torah, and presumably people listen.
And then I thought in one of the said words, it's got various conditions about whether if a prophet tells you to break certain things from the Torah, you can't listen to them. It says it in the Torah, doesn't it? Something along those lines.
It's not clear that there's any specific red lines about what they can and cannot tell you to change. There are other questions of how do you know it's a real prophet or not, because the Torah is alive to that issue, as are the rest of the books of Tanakh. But it's not as clear that, like idolatry is the big one, and probably some others. But it's not clear they couldn't change the Torah. For one thing, you could see even in small ways, they're going to cancel Trumas and Maestros. We're no longer going to do taxes and giving tithes and things like that. Could be a really big deal. One for poor people, two for Kohanim. And that doesn't have the same place in the Torah as issues like sexual relations, idolatry, or murder. But that would still be a big deal if prophets could just change that. So what's happening in Tanur Shalach Nai is this moment of the victory of the Torah over continuing prophecy. That the Torah is God's word, and in some sense, the last word. You can have other prophecy for other stuff. No one says, oh, we have the Torah, we don't listen to anyone who says do tshuva. it's always a good idea to listen to people say tshuva, but there can't be a prophecy that overrides the Torah.
Yeah, I think we learned that from it says something like that in one of these centers. Yeah.
Well, I think that's that's the idea the Gemara is certainly trying to get at here. There is one thing that needs to be noted about that, though, and I remember the first time someone pointed this out to me, which is that Chazal are doing something a little weird with the phrase, we should follow the majority. Achar Rabim Lahatot. The verse comes from the end of Parshat Mishpatim, almost the end, part of a whole long series of psukim, all kinds of topics. In the specific place, it's talking about you might have thought you should not exactly follow the law for a good reason, right? It says, do not favor a widow or an orphan in justice. You might think, I should take care of this person. The Chazal and the Prophet, the Torah, they all want us to take care of the people who, can't take care of themselves. But judgment is judgment. You don't corrupt that even to take care of someone who needs help. And so in that context, the Torah says, Lo tihye acher rabim liraot, v'lo ta'aneh al rov lintot acher rabim lahatot. You shall neither side with the majority to do wrong, you shall not give perverse testimony in dispute so as to pervert it in favor of the majority. That last bit, to pervert it in favor of the majority, is the translation from Sefaria for acher harabim lahatot. You shouldn't follow the majority when it's wrong. So a pasuk that says don't follow the majority when it's wrong becomes in Chazal follow the majority. The majority, in some sense, makes something right. And so the trick is that there's all kinds of nuancing ways you can read that. So don't follow the majority when it's wrong means that there could be times when it's perfectly clear the majority is wrong, and it's just like they're going against an established law or whatever. Then you don't follow them. But when there's no established law, then maybe we follow the majority. So another possibility is that it comes down to your distinction before about what do you do versus what does everybody do. Following personal rules versus like who's setting the law for everybody. So one place that comes up is a law called Zaken Mamre, or rebellious elder. Someone who just totally disagrees with how the rest of the leaders, the Jewish people, are ruling, does not have to follow them the same way. One of the Zaken, the elders, but he can't teach other people what he thinks is right is what people should do, because the majority rules. When it comes to setting the law, and it's the same thing. That distinction between the one guy on the one side and the majority on the other is the same as the prophet on one side and the Torah on the other. There's a stability involved versus the charismatic leader. If anyone who can just convince people that he's right can tell people what to do and what's the rule, then you could have all kinds of different people deciding what people are going to do. There's an element of stability involved in the majority deciding, what the law is going forward. So, sort of in short, that's what I think is happening in the Gemara, and is part of the basic program of Torah Shabbat Peh. I want to for a second just make an analogy to the U.S. constitutional law. U.S. constitutional law has been plagued by all kinds of debates, but famously one between what's called like originalism versus, on the other hand, seeing the Constitution as a living document. The idea that we need to get back to the original meaning of what the founders of the United States who wrote the Constitution had in mind, on the one hand, versus the idea that the Constitution is a living document that's meant to evolve with the people, not by changing it in some radical way, though constitutional amendments are a different category, but by understanding the full potential of its words. And just to give an example of that sort of mindset, there was a man named Robert Cover who was a constitutional scholar, Jewish guy, not Orthodox to my knowledge, certainly not never going to yeshiva, but had all kinds of really interesting and phenomenal essays, reading Torah through the lens of law and law through the lens of Torah. But he also dealt with abolitionists and people who talked about the Constitution while trying to get rid of slavery. And some of them were saying, look, the Constitution permits slavery, so we need an amendment to change that. But some of them said the Constitution does not permit slavery, which is empirically false. But the event is that the Constitution has a spirit to it, and that spirit could not possibly allow slavery. And so we have to follow the spirit, if not necessarily the letter of the law. And that sense of, like, the Constitution is who we are, right? We as a people are bound to this document, and our spirit is the same spirit it has. So we need to be interpreting law and making laws and deciding laws based on the spirit of the document. Is sort of where that comes from. It's not exactly what's happening with Chazal, because it's Chazal weren't going to try and change laws per se, but they has the same sense of the words have a spirit to them, because it's still a contrast to the originalist approach. The originalist approach, I think, is worth talking about because it's an instinct a lot of us deeply share. What do words mean? Particularly in a text. When someone writes, like when you're reading a text, what do those words mean? We generally think it means what the author said it meant, right? The author wrote something, and that's what it means. But the way that the abolitionists read the Constitution, the way people read the Constitution today, is that the Constitution was written once, but it was written for all time. That when you write something for the moment and for the moment after that and after that, throughout history, the meanings you have in mind have to be much broader than you could imagine then. So the famous places this comes up in constitutional debate are like, who has rights and who has what rights? Because what did the founders have in mind when they talk about citizens? And things like that. And you could read that as narrowly as possible to who was a sort of obviously full member of society in the 1700s, or you could read that more broadly to who has full rights as a full member of society today. But all of that is based on a fundamental commitment to the Constitution. The idea that the United States is the nation that founds itself on this document and lives with this document and decides law based on this document throughout its whole history. And that, I think, is the same fundamental spirit that's underlying Chazal's project of Torah Sheba'al Peh, is that we're going to carry this document with us even though it's not the same moment when we got it. In some sense, the question of authorial intent. What was the intent of the moment it was written? Becomes much more intense when you're talking about divine intent, that God's intent in the Torah. But on the same moment, becomes much less decidable. You never have to worry, did I get to the right intent? Because we assume a human author can only have one thing in mind when they write their document, which is what is going to mean in that moment. And it's a lot harder to push that assumption onto God, that God would perhaps be the one author who could have meant many things. That for the words to be divine might be the most freeing of their intent, rather than trying to lock them into one intent.
Doesn't this also go to a good degree to, I think, something we see nowadays in the world of psak, between much more Shamani styles of giving over psak and trying to stick to older methods versus, I guess, halachic innovation to a degree? That we see people saying that there is a certain spirit of the law which we can follow versus we must stick to what was always done.
Yes, you could take it that way. That's why I was saying I want to say Chazal weren't doing exactly that, because the question of how innovation works really gets down to the question of how much you adhere to the words of the Torah and the words that have been used in the past. That it's very possible. There are two ways to innovate, in a sense. One is to say things have changed, we have to do something new. And another has to say things have changed, therefore we have to do something old in a different way. And I think that's a critical distinction, is when it comes to questions of inclusion within the community, when it comes to questions of participation in communal events, that you can just say, look, things are different now. And we're going to do something new, but we are still fundamentally Jews. We still fundamentally believe in the same God. We still fundamentally believe in the same text, even though we need to do new things. But that's very different from saying, no, the best way to follow the Torah here, to be as loyal to the Torah as possible in these new circumstances, is to do something different than was done before, but it's actually fundamentally doing the same thing, because what we're doing is keeping the Torah, and that's what they were doing before. And they're very different ways, I think, of innovating. They can have practical effects, but also they don't necessarily. They could look almost exactly the same, but I think there's a very different spirit and obviously very different words. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to it's kind of just like a funny anecdote, but I think it illustrates the point. Is that when I was in the army, I was teaching a poem in Hebrew, and one of the main characters in the poem was David. And David was doing all these things to redeem the Jewish people and blah 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 blah, like B'yamot HaMashiach and all this stuff. And obviously the authorial intent was David HaMelech. I was teaching it to a group of about 100 or 150 completely non-religious students, and reading about somebody named David in the context of the redemption of the Jewish people and the founding of the state of Israel. One of the soldiers read the entire poem, and it was like a legit, attainable interpretation. The entire poem talking about David ben Gurion, and so it was kind of the question I kind of thought of was like, well, is it an illegitimate interpretation of the poem, meaning the words are makayim that interpretation 100%. Wasn't the intent of the author, but the author is kivyochol unleashed this literary creation that supports multiple different interpretations, and the fact that it's a whole other discussion about whether or not words can have independent meaning for what the words are just kind of like empty vessels that the author just pours whatever he wants into, or if they they can serve greater purposes. But it's the same ideas. I always just think of that story.
Right. No, this is a literary debate that's a philosophical literary debate that raged throughout the 20th century and before. And poetry has really remained one of the arenas that most people think can be free from the absolute struggle for historical meaning. It's not everyone thinks that. Lots of people think it only means what the author meant, but I think more people are on board with reading poetry a little more broadly. But it's worth noting that this idea of how words work and how intent works and meaning works was not something people always thought, and does not apply to every text. It is in many ways a product of the historical approach of the Enlightenment, in which that we're studying historical texts and we want to find out what they meant back then. And there's a really interesting critique from a 20th century philosopher named Hans-Georg Gadamer, German guy. But he talks about basically when you're doing that, when you're saying there's this historical text, what did it mean in that time period? You've started by saying it's not truth. You said it's a historical object. Because truth is something that makes claims in us and speaks to us. That I want to read this text for what it says to my life. It's very different for how did its original audience read it? What did the author mean when they wrote it? And so a critical aspect of what it means to be Jewish is to read the Torah for that question of what does the Torah mean to my life and our life as a community, rather than what did it mean once upon a time.
Why is putting the internet in its historical context taking away from how relevant it can be to your life?
It doesn't have to be. We'll have to immediately step back from that distinction I just made a little bit, because you could say, how did people understand it then? What does that mean for my life now? But the roots of the historicist distinction are in many ways, the idea of looking for what the words originally meant, as opposed to the question of what does it speak to my life, what does it say to me today. It very quickly can lead you away from the distinction I made to begin with is very natural. It is not necessary at all, and I am very much in favor of studying the pshat of the Tanakh and the Torah to understand what did the words mean in context in their original sense and all kinds of things like that. But I think it has the potential to be very limiting and reductive and almost strangling of the words in a way that doesn't have to be.
So you think it's more better to read the Torah and think, how can I apply it to my life, than learn the history?
Absolutely not. I think those two questions should not be separated, even though they easily could be.
So what did you say?
I think the tendency is to separate those two when we ask what the words mean. And I think you should never separate them, and you shouldn't let the question of history dominate the discussion. That's sort of what I'm getting at. Is that That
That story about the heavenly voice, do you think it happened, or was just basically sort of metaphor to show that nowadays the way forward is the sages and not prophecy? I think that was what they were getting at in that story. More than whether literally a heavenly voice appeared, because I thought we know that when the prophet stopped, there was nothing. There was no more prophecy.
So I'm going to give a couple answers. I don't know if any of them will be helpful. The first is that it's easy to distinguish between like prophecy, capital P, and like a heavenly voice. Maybe those are different. But the other answer is that I have like a really depressing view on what we can know about history. I don't think we can read this text and have any idea what happened or didn't happen. What I think
maybe, as I said, it's just a lesson for us to learn that maybe the way forward now isn't that prophecy.
Well, this gets back to the question of not letting the question of history dominate the discussion.
Yes.
Is that I think, and part like beyond the fact that I don't think we have any way of knowing what happened or didn't happen, I think caring too deeply about what happened or didn't happen misses the point.
It sounds a bit like we learn all the way through Tanakh that when prophets happened, they weren't meant to know. God said to Moses, and God prophesied to Yoshua to do conquer the land, and then God prophesied with David, and all through these. I haven't read the whole I haven't read all the Tanakh, but through the Tanakh, God prophesied to the people.
Right.
So for the Gemara to then have that story that then something happened and we were told to ignore it. Sounds a bit more metaphorical than if strange if it actually happened. If we learn throughout the Tanakh that prophecy is taken seriously.
Right. So I think for me the question is I just think the question of whether or not it happened is not what interests me so much as why is it being told. Right, the Gemara is telling me that story.
To teach us more.
What? No,
so you're focused on more what's being told, whether it's the historical content, which gets back to what you said a few minutes ago. I understand that.
Yeah, I'm much more concerned with why it's being told, because I think that question really is independent in many ways of the question of like, did it happen or not? They're not entirely unrelated. I don't think you can always ignore the historical question, but I think it cannot be allowed to dominate the conversation.
Sure.
Anyone else? Okay, so I want to make one last point about this Gemara, which is that, like I said, Chazal go back to this question of who is mighty, or the Anshe Hagdolah. I want to go back to the fourth parak of Pirkei Avot. Who is mighty is someone who conquers his inclination. And the proof text is from Mishlei, he that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he that rules his spirit than he that takes a city. It's a phenomenal text for this Gemara, because it's literally about not conquering. So if the Anshe Hagdolah are going to say, what makes God mighty is that he does not conquer the nations of the world, well, that's exactly what Mishlei says. But I think there needs to be a balance there in appreciating the oldness of what Chazal are saying and the newness of it. That they're not saying, oh, Yirmiyahu and Daniel just were ignorant of the tradition. They didn't know about this pasuk from Mishlei, or the idea that what really means to be a gibor is to have restraint. That they, plausibly, based on this Gemara, were the first people to ever think about applying that idea to God. Maybe there's other people, but that, plausibly, based on this Gemara, they were open to the possibility that what's happening is an expression of God. That Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel said, no, we can't say this is happening because God's making it happen. Because they're not saying, we can't say this is happening because this is what God's mightiness means, that God's awesomeness means this. And the Anshe Hagdolah were open to that new possibility. That one critical element in not lying about God, in not insisting that things look differently than they actually look, is the possibility of recognizing new ways God manifests in the world. I want to clarify with the lying about God bit. If Yirmiyahu and Daniel had said God is awesome and mighty, for them they would have been saying God is, terrifying to the nations and conquers them, and that's empirically false, right? So they're not going to assert something as reality when it's not reality. They're not going to try and say words that contradict reality. But Anshe Knesset Gedola, by listening very closely to reality, are able to hear new things in the words themselves. That the words we use to describe God can still speak to different realities and still carry the meanings of different realities. But you can't notice that if you're so busy denying that reality. That if you're so busy insisting that something is true, even if it doesn't match what you're experiencing, then you can't hear the possibility about that, something that God really is different than you think God is, that you've had too small and immature a perspective of God, that you need to be open to new ways of God manifesting in the world. This is one of the key lessons of Sefer Eov. Eov is about a man suffering and insisting that he has no idea why he's suffering, and that doesn't make any sense, and why is God doing this to him, and then he has his friends. And his friends are very insistent that there's a good reason he's suffering. He may not know what it is, but God is just, and that's fine. And the book does not, in any sense, conclude by saying God is not just, but it concludes with God saying Eov's right. The friends are rebuked, and Eov receives revelation. The revelation is essentially, you can't understand me, and I was the one who made the universe, and I have created things so far beyond you can't understand the things I created. And the question of, what does it mean to try and understand God is really foregrounded there. But Eov is open to things being different from the same old line that God is just. Eov doesn't do it. Eov is not the Anshe Knesset Gedola here. He doesn't come up with a new way of understanding that phrase. But he's Yirmiyahu and Daniel. He refuses to lie about God. He says that my experience of the world is not something I can apply the words God is just to. I can't apply the words, God is giving me good things. The beginning of the story is good things, the end of the story is good things, but not in the middle. And in that time, he doesn't insist that God is giving him good things. And I think that's a sort of key bit of, what Anshe Knesset Gedola are doing in this story. And it is about that openness to the world and to the way we experience reality. I think for people living in the 21st century, the two biggest moments of that in recent history are the Holocaust and the State of Israel. That our relationship with God, in some sense, is qualitatively different than it was beforehand, before the Holocaust happened and before the State of Israel happened. And the trick to being Jewish nowadays is learning to use old words to talk about those new scenarios. Well, let's give the example of the Holocaust. There's a really interesting book called Theologia shel Cheser, and it's the theology of absence. It was written recently by Yishai Mavorach, who's a student of Shagar's. He lives in Elon Shvutz, and is very much grappling with this question of what does it mean to be Jewish and Orthodox and adhere to Jewish texts, etc., after the Holocaust. And he quotes a piece from Rabbi Nachman, I think from Chaim Moharan, about you have to pray with without perfect kavanah. Because if you pray with perfect kavanah, then there's a kitrut, which means like an accusation against you. And he doesn't ask, what did Rabbi Nachman mean when he says this? But he says, I think it's very clear what it means after 1945. To daven, you have to have somewhere in your mind the issue of what did all of those people do what happened when they prayed, and what does prayer mean in general. And if you can't pray while also being aware of the ethical and historical issues involved in prayer, then there's a moral accusation against that. You have to recognize it's not like, I'm praying well and they prayed badly and that's why they died. No, prayer is not. The best line is Professor Yishai Lippis, God's not an ATM machine. That prayer is not pushing buttons to get what you want. That there are ethical issues with the idea that prayer works perfectly.
It's also connected to sacrifices, to sacrifices as well. I think prayer at the beginning was basically taken over from the sacrifices, wasn't it? I know there was some prayer that we know evidence in the Torah people used to pray, but the actual order of prayer that was connected to the order of sacrifices, wasn't it?
order is a broad term. There's clearly prayer beforehand, as you noted.
Yeah, but there wasn't set prayers like it was now until the temple was destroyed, wasn't it?
Was set. You're getting to the first and second temple question again as well, and hard again to know exactly what was happening when and what was set prayers and what was not. But the Chazal are very clear that one of the ways we get the specific daily structure of prayer we have today is based on the structure of the sacrifices. Yes. But yeah, so that's an example of what it means to take seriously the changed events of our lives in history, while also being like living through Jewish words and still living according to the Torah and the words of the Jewish past. And the same thing is true, I think, of every attempt to navigate the question of like religion and state in the state of Israel. There's people on both sides of that spectrum, beyond like talking about secular and Haredi, people who from within the religious Zionist camp who think it should be more based on like the state of Israel should run according to Torah law, the state of Israel should not run at all according to Torah law. But everyone's trying to do that through understanding what people have said, what Jews have said, going back not just to past generations or the Gemara, even to Tanakh. And I think that's a sort of critical part of the endeavor, of like what it means to be Jewish, and come after destruction in any sort of time. Any questions?
So you're saying that some people feel like you should pray with too much kavanah, like you see some in synagogues, some people like or pray with look mad to kavanah in people on all different religious levels, and you say because it's trying to say it sounds a bit. I've never heard it before. Basically, that people say you shouldn't maybe pray with too much kavanah because of the Holocaust.
Well, that I'm not sure how many people have said that. I gave one example. I thought it was a good example. There's a fascinating Gemara in Brachot on Lamed Bet or Lamed Gimel about not praying too long, which I think is similar, but we can talk about it separately.
I think would it be accurate to say like basically kind of like the point maybe tell me if is that you don't want to pray with absolute certainty. You don't want to pray with absolute certainty that what I am doing is the way to approach God, and what I am doing will obtain the
Nobody knows anyway. Nobody knows how God. Nobody knows exactly when you pray what happens anyway. Nobody knows why. Nobody knows why. Like my as I said, bad people get away with stuff, and then good people like why a lot of people died in the Holocaust when they pray. Nobody knows.
Yes, and yet there are still books written on like how to get what you want by praying.
But then there's also people saying that sometimes maybe it's God's will that you die early, and then there's also the case that you said we get free will as well.
Okay.
Only said there's free will as well, so it's like,
yeah. Okay. It is been a little more than an hour, and I think it might make sense to save a lot of these texts for the next time. Instead of coming up with a whole new year, we'll just do the second half of this year. But I want to flip quickly to the last source, second to last source, because I think it's awesome. It's from a little book called Chasidim Tzochakim Mizeh by Rav Menachem Froman.
is this at the back of the book, so?
Yeah, that's perfect. Source 5. Rav Menachem Froman, he said he would reference his friend Rav Shagar, and then he's going to give his own opinion. He said Rav Shagar used to critique the religious community, saying that their faith was not realistic; it was illusory. So that's Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel, Yirmiyahu and Daniel, who refused to lie. And he says, in my eyes, the problem with religious people's faith is that instead of faith in God, it's become faith in ourselves, in the rightness of our path, our worldview, and who we are. It therefore closes off our hearts to the divine. That a critical aspect of not lying about God, as I said, is in fact leaves us open to God. That being too set in the way we think about God actually keeps us from being in contact with God. And that's true in relationships in general. If you have a specific idea of who someone is, you're actually not really interacting with them so much anymore because you filtered all of your interactions through that way of thinking about them. And so I think part of what this whole thing is getting to, and I read a very powerful drasha about this, Rav Froman's reading of the Kamsa and Bar Kamsa story, is that it's honestly just about trying too hard to explain why things happened. It comes along with, it was because of two chickens that Hashem was destroyed or whatever. That there's a sense of the Chazal are saying you can try and find reasons for these things. It's coming down to little stuff. Part of what's key is just being open to God being different from how you've thought of God before. Not trying to like tie God down too much.
I said, that's a bit, so what's I going to do? How does that help though? Nobody knows exactly what you're about.
No, but people, I think that's the message of this, is accept a little bit that you don't know. And don't speak too confidently about God.
No, I agree, because there were some people that, do you remember this thing about the tsunami in 2004 when a lot of people